Welcome. I'm Peter Fox Penner of the Brattle Group, and on behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy here at the McDonough School, the Brattle Group, and us four co-authors of Market Power and Market Manipulation, which is the book whose commemoration triggered this event. We want to welcome you to this symposium. I want to begin by thanking all of you for taking some time out of your day, and all the panelists and the commissioner for traveling, some across the country, some across town, and also by asking everybody who hasn't to grab a lunch, as this is the lunch portion of the program. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeff Mocker from the center here to say a little welcome. Jeff's a professor of strategy and economics here at the McDonough School. He's the director of the Center for Business and Public Policy, which is hosting us, teaches graduate courses in microeconomics, competitive strategy, management of technology, and innovation. He also has a distinguished career in strategy consulting, and he's a member of the Academy of Management and many other distinguished societies. So please welcome Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to say a few words about the Center for Business and Public Policy and give you an idea of where you are. You're in the middle of campus. In fact, this used to be the baseball field, but we kicked the baseball team off, and they now play in Potomac. This building's about 5 years old now. This room is called the Fisher Colloquium. It's for hosting events such as this. And as you can see, it's a pretty nice place to spend an afternoon. If you get bored with the presentations, which I'm sure you won't, you can look outside at the rest of the campus. So the Center for Business and Public Policy was founded in 2002 by John Mayo. And John would have been here, but he has a conflict at another event downtown. John's the executive director of the center. The center is housed in this building, in this school, the McDonough School of Business. It's an academic and nonpartisan research center. And what we do is we engage academics, industry practitioners, and policymakers on issues at the nexus of business and public policy. So think any business issue that is affected by public policy making, or any public policy issue that might affect how businesses operate. We do this through two activities. First, programming, seminars, colloquia, conferences, Symposia, and Georgetown on the Hill series, this being one of those types of events. And the other is through research output, through our journal articles, our economic policy vignettes, our white papers, where many of our senior policy scholars participate. Our research areas are largely economic focused via both micro and macro. We do a lot of IO, antitrust regulation work, and a lot of macroecon as well. We have particular areas of concentration, one being the digital economy, telecom, internet, one being trade, commerce. We do a lot of work in rail. We do a lot of work in cybersecurity. And through Peter, we do a lot of work in energy. Our personnel are senior policy fellows, senior industry and innovation fellows, center affiliates, both within and outside of the McDonough School, within and outside of Georgetown, and then within and outside of DC. So we have relationships with the Analysis Group, the Brattle Group, the Conference Board, the Technology Policy Institute, just to name a few. We also have relationships with other institutions, including the University of Michigan, Oxford University, and UC Berkeley, among others. So I want to welcome you here. For those of you that need a bio break, just walk across the bridge, and the bathrooms for women are on the left and for men on the right. With that, I'm going to sort of end, because I know Peter wants to do the formal introductions, but I hope you have a very good and stimulating conference. Thanks for coming.
To introduce Diana, I'd like to introduce another of my co-authors, Dr. Rumgau Brame. Rumgau is a principal at the Brattle Group. She is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, an excellent place. And she's an expert in market power and antitrust, been involved in many, many FERC antitrust market power proceedings and lots of other things. So, Rumgau, over to you.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Diana Moss, our first moderator for the first panel, Market Power in Energy Markets. Diana Moss became president of the American Antitrust Institute in January 2015. Diana has developed and expanded the AAI's advocacy channels and strategies. Her work spans antitrust and regulation with industry expertise in electric, petroleum, agriculture, airlines, telecommunications, and healthcare. She has strengthened communications with enforcers, Congress, other advocacy groups, and the media. She has published many articles in economics and legal journals. In addition to serving as adjunct professor at Department of Economics at University of Colorado Boulder, she has served as a senior economist at the FERC and as an economic consultant for many excellent firms. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you Dr. Diana Moss. Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear? Or am I speaking through two microphones at this point? Okay, thank you very much to Peter and to the Brattle Group and to Georgetown University for hosting this event. It's an honor to be here. I have not seen some of you for many years now, and we encounter each other in different venues, but for those of you who are newer to this domain, you're really sitting in a room with many of the major gurus and thought leaders in the area of energy and market power and market manipulation. So this is a real treat to be around this kind of intellectual firepower and energy. And it's my great honor, as I said, to moderate this first panel on market power. So we have three experts in market power today. To my left here is Jade Eaton, who is a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Antitrust Division. Jade is steeped in energy markets, antitrust enforcement, and is probably one of the most knowledgeable people I know about the nexus between antitrust and regulation in terms of competition policy and enforcement. She has worked on numerous merger cases, other types of enforcement actions, Section 1 cases, for example, in energy markets, and it's a delight to have her here. Bill Hogan, at the end of the table, is the Raymond Planck Professor of Global Energy Policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Bill is probably another leading thought leader on the design of organized markets and market rules. I remember citing Bill's work in my own PhD dissertation many, many years ago. I won't date myself by revealing the year that I got my PhD, but has written extensively on the issues of political economy and economics in electricity markets. And then finally, Steve Puller, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Texas A&M. Steve is more recently on the scene and one of the what I call the next generation of experts, IO economists with expertise in regulation and empirical microeconomics. One of the more recent comers to the field, providing some really amazing empirical analysis of energy markets, things like pricing effects, efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So these are our panelists. And what I'm going to do is to let each of them make about an 8 to 10 minute opening statement. And then I have a series of questions that I would like to ask each of them and to generate some conversation and also bring in members of the audience. So with that, why don't we start with Bill?
Thank you, Diana, and I'm happy to have the pleasure to be back in Washington and enjoying the opportunity to learn more about the Georgetown campus, and I appreciate being invited to speak here today, and I hope I will be invited back, but I'm not so sure after I get through talking. I don't speak on behalf of the Harvard Electricity Policy Group or anybody else. These are just my own views. I'm going to try to go through quickly here the storyline in order to set up the conversation, and it's had to adapt a little bit. When we were first talking about having this conference, I was given the charge to try to say a few words about the definition of market power and what it means and how we can think about measuring and controlling that. And then but the conference, as you know, was motivated by this book. The book came out, and I finally had a chance to read the book, and so I reoriented a little bit because I think the sequence of having this conversation without talking about the book and then having the book talked about at the next session later on is actually not going to be so helpful. So as to the first responsibility, the definition of market power, I don't have anything profound to say about this. This graphic appears, it's not exactly the graphic, but the same idea appears in the book, talking about focusing particularly on real-time electricity markets where you've got supply and demand, and you have somebody with market power, and they withhold some of that capacity, either by physically withholding it or by raising their bids either way in order to balance their marginal revenues, and recognizing that they have a strategic effect on price. And that produces higher prices and lower quantities, and as an economic inefficiency component, which is the deadweight loss, which is the shaded area in the graphic. So this is all Economics 101. Everybody's familiar with this argument. I consider it to be the simple case. The critical characteristics are the fact that there is withholding and there's deadweight loss and all the other kinds of things that are going along with it. And I think it's actually, although simple, I think it's very important to keep it in mind as we start talking about a lot of these cases that are discussed in this afternoon and in the context of this book. And in particular, I've drawn here another example of a different kind of problem where you have something that you see in these organized markets, which goes under the heading of hockey stick bidding, where you have a small amount that might be bid at a high price. Most of the stuff is offered at a low price, but the demand clears at the very high price. There's no withholding, so there's no reduction in the capacity that's actually ultimately made available, and there's no deadweight loss, so there's no economic inefficiency. And if you compare the two graphics, the previous one to this one, the question arises, does this represent the exercise of market power? My answer is no, because it doesn't have withholding and it doesn't have any deadweight loss, but you will find a discussion in this volume takes an opposite view. And I think that's actually a problem which is going to come up later, but we can probably talk about that. I think the problem of market power in electricity markets and real-time electricity markets is real and ubiquitous. There are many different hypothetical situations and real situations, but I don't think it's a big problem. And the reason I don't think it's a big problem is because there's an easy fix. And the easy fix is what we do in these organized markets is to have offer caps, particularly if we have generator-specific offer caps, which is say, we're going to give you an estimate of your, if we think you have market power, we'll estimate your variable cost. We'll put a little inflation on top of that to make sure we didn't make too big a mistake. And then we'll let you bid up to that offer cap, but you get paid the market clearing price. You don't get paid what you offered, you get paid whatever the market clearing price is. And that emulates the competitive market. It's easy to do, we do it all over the place. And as a result of that, in these organized markets, you continuously get reports from the market monitors that in the real-time energy market, things look like they're competitive and the outcomes are quite good. And there's no withholding and so on. So market power is real and there's an easy fix that we can in fact deal with in real-time markets. In dealing with other kinds of markets in the energy sector, particularly day-ahead and forward markets, that's a much more complicated problem because those are not real-time markets. You can't physically withhold in those markets, and they're financial markets primarily, and I think the analysis has to be much more sophisticated in trying to deal with those problems, but I think the real problem of market power in real time can be addressed rather well. The critical feature that I would keep asking everybody to come back to in thinking about this problem is withholding if you're exercising market power. And it's often, I referred to this and have referred to it in the past as gap analysis. And what I have here is an example of one such case that came out of the California energy crisis. This story does not at least the way it's presented here doesn't appear in the book. But when there were the shortage hours, the California Public Utility Commission came forward and said that generators were withholding, and they identified the generators and identified how much they were withholding and asserted that this was a terrible thing. And then it was analyzed by the California Independent System Operator and later by FERC and its staff, and they came back and said, no, they weren't. So it just basically, it could be explained by environmental rules and outages and ramping constraints and all other kinds of technical details that come up in the dispatch. And I would argue that if you haven't addressed those things, you're not having a serious conversation. And here they did have a serious conversation, and they did address it, and they came back and said, no, they weren't withholding. Now, if you read it closely, you'll see they wrote it in such a way that they hated saying it. And so they said, you can't generalize this to anything else other than the numbers we're looking at for these hours and these days in this particular case. But I tell you that this was the case that was brought forward, and it said they were withholding, and the answer was, no, they weren't. Now we have this book dealing with the story of market powers and manipulation, and there's good news and there's bad news. And I've summarized here what I think of as the bad news that comes out of this book. First is it discusses, in the book, parts 1 and part 2 are devoted primarily to discussing the California situation and that experience. And I think that's a real problem. There are general agreement that the California model with the PX and the Cal ISO was fatally flawed. No one was more vocal about this problem than I was before the fact. So, as Bill will remember, they canceled my passport, and I wasn't allowed to go to California for 4 years because of the things that I said about it. So nobody has more standing at saying that that was a terrible design and that market didn't work. The regulators, like Bill Massey and his colleagues, were under enormous pressure with prices at the time that were, quote, just unreasonable. I'm not sure if the person who said that is prepared to have that a public quote, but I definitely remember who said it, and if they want to step forward and take credit for it, I'd be happy to acknowledge that. But I thought it was a brilliant observation which captured the fundamental problem in California, which is these prices were just too high, and we hated it. And then everything else was just smoke and mirrors after that. We just didn't like them, but when you actually tried to analyze it, you didn't get the kind of answers that we wanted. We had a sitting governor in California who never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And because of his performance, he was recalled. So that was pretty bad. So my view of the California fiasco is completely different than is described in this book. And I think the one thing I would say from having read it is that you cannot use the California fiasco as an example or a lesson for the future, other than if you have really crummy market design, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. My own view of this in terms of the market power story and manipulation is summarized by the quote here, which is quoting me. And what I said was, with respect to the California crisis, there are no confirmed cases of withholding to exercise market power and manipulate prices. And I stand by that statement, and I'll be happy to discuss it later. There are a lot of other bad things that happened, a lot of other terrible behavior on the part of all kinds of participants. I'm not defending that, but I'm saying in terms of the lessons about market power and manipulation, you don't learn much from looking at the California experience. And that's the bad part of what I see in this story. The good part is really good, however, and it is worthwhile paying very close attention to, and that's part 3 of this book. And there is a completely different story. And there, what we have is work which draws on Sean Ledgerwood's earlier paper, which I've looked at and talked about before, and I've just extracted from here. But let me skip to the slightly revised version that appears in the current volume of the Bush book. This is my transcription of figure 10.1. And I want you to all go back and read this chapter and get to the stage of figure 10.1 and read figure 10.1. And I have some quibbles about some of the wording and all this kind of stuff, but in the big picture, no, I think it's exactly right. And what it does is lays out a series of steps of what would be needed in order to sow this framework for manipulation, not the least of which is beginning with the presumption of transactional legitimacy, and then identifying the behavior and analyzing whether or not it was connected to what was going on, and was there a financial position that you could profit from, and did you actually move the prices enough in order to do that, and have some explanation of the theory, and then we get all down to the end, and if you have satisfied all of those conditions, then you have market manipulation. And very importantly, the authors say, and I agree, all these conditions are necessary. And that's why the diagram has all these little branches that go off. If you say, no, you didn't satisfy that condition, then you haven't demonstrated market manipulation. The individual conditions are not sufficient. They're necessary. Those are different ideas. Think about that, because it's very important in this conversation. I actually agree with this framework pretty much. We could refine it slightly, but I don't think it's worth the trouble. I think it's right on, and it's heading us in the right direction. It's the right way we should think about it. Then we have what's actually going on in FERC, in the Enforcement Office, and this is Bill Hogan. My wife doesn't even take credit for this, right? So I don't speak on behalf of anybody else. This is just my view of what's going on here in this situation. And what you have here is a situation where we don't have the presumptions that are embedded in that framework. It starts with non-fraud fraud. So we have this horrible situation, I think, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission doesn't have enough authority in order to deal with a lot of these problems. The fraud-based authority is not sufficient to deal with what they need to deal with, but it's their legal basis. So what they do is keep redefining the word. And so it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just completely confusing, and it obscures what's actually going on. And then we have bad acts, which is you did something and I didn't like it. And if you did something I didn't like it, then I know it when I see it, then that's manipulation. And I think that's a not unfair description of a lot of what's actually going on right now. It is not a principle-based system, and it is very, very dangerous for many reasons. Then we look to see if people had financial positions. We don't bother to analyze the market or how you could have affected the prices or what the connections could be. So the whole thing that's called the nexus here is just sort of waved away in that process. And then we come down to scienter, is there evidence of intent? And if there's evidence of intent and you did something I don't like, we conclude that there is sufficient evidence now to find you guilty of manipulation. So we skipped all the steps, redefined the critical terms, and ended up with prosecutions under these enforcement actions, which I think would not withstand scrutiny out in a court or in the public domain. Unfortunately, this is all going on behind the scenes in a very opaque world of the settlement process, but every once in a while something creeps out in the settlement process that you can point to that reinforces the argument that I'm making. Here is a case which is settled, so it doesn't bring up the ex parte issues. This is the Deutsche Bank case, which I was involved in and I know a lot about, and I happen to know that the settlement document did not describe a lot of what was actually going on there, but I did extract something from it. And in the middle of this statement, which was in the settlement document produced by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it says, even if these physical transactions, this is the emphasized part, even if these physical transactions had been profitable, however, profitability is not determinative on the question of manipulation and does not inoculate trading from potential manipulation claim. So it violates step one of the framework that was laid out in this story, and it takes economic transactions but interprets those as bad acts. And I think that's a very serious problem because, as I said at the bottom here, this policy strikes at the heart of the necessary condition for successful wholesale markets. I'm happy to elaborate on that during the question and answer period. So my advice is skip part 1 and 2 and study part 3.
How's that? Okay, good. There you go. Took a second. Thanks a lot to the organizers for putting on this symposium. I think it's a great opportunity to share different viewpoints on market power and electricity markets in general. So when I was kind of cutting my teeth on economic research, I was actually a PhD student doing research on the electricity market. That was my California electricity market. That was my dissertation. That was what I was on the job market at the time when kind of the lights were going out and so forth. So as I kind of read the book beforehand, before coming to this conference, I had some, nice flashbacks to terms like beep stack and fat boy and thin man, and Bill had a paper up here earlier that had Death Star on it. when I teach my undergrads about the California electricity crisis, I talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger. And when I grew up, Schwarzenegger was the Terminator. But of course, they're so young, so they just think of him as the governor of California. And some would say because of the California electricity crisis. So fun flashbacks to California. But what I'm going to do actually is not so much talk about California and just talk more generally from kind of an economic perspective about analyzing competition in deregulated electricity markets. And my thoughts are going to come through the lens of economic analysis, not so much from legal analysis. So what that essentially means is I'm going to think about factors that affect efficiency in wholesale markets, which basically means efficiency means, at least from the short run perspective, do you get least cost production? Do you get least cost dispatch? And do you see prices that are competitive? So it's kind of Bill outlined, at some level, the key question of identifying market power, at least if you're thinking about it from kind of an Econ 1 level, is actually, very straightforward. But it gets really complicated once you get into the inner workings both of the markets and then how firms operate. So conceptually, what you basically want to know in these bid-based markets is you want to know when generators are submitting bids, do they have the incentive to bid, say, for example, above marginal cost in order to influence the price? And if they have that incentive, do they respond to those incentives? And of course, the reason is that in all of the organized markets in the US, we have, the lingo is basically a multi-unit uniform price auction, which is fancy language for stack-up supply and demand, and that market clearing price is the price that everybody gets paid. And so the question is, when you're submitting bids, do you have an incentive to try and change that price, influence that price, because it's going to change your revenues. So in essence, from kind of an Econ 1 perspective, what you want to know is you want to know, do firms face a residual demand function, a firm-level demand function that has slope to it, right? Because if it has some slope to it, that basically means by changing their production or changing their bids, they can influence what the price is. So in the simplest formulation, it's actually quite straightforward. And even if you can find settings where it's as simple as I just described, the analytics are tough, but it's definitely doable. But where it gets more complicated, of course, is, as we know, is when you add a lot of kind of, real operating decisions in the market. So, for example, what happens if generators own financial transmission rights or congestion revenue rights, depending on what market you're in. So basically have incentives to change what the nodal prices are. If it's a multi-settlement market, so if a generator is bidding into the day-ahead market, they have to think about what the opportunity cost is of bidding in the day-ahead market and what that means for the real-time market. So the residual demand concept isn't as well defined. Moreover, there are ancillary service markets as well. And then, additionally, adding complication is for calculating residual demand, one needs to know what imports are. So unless you're in a place like Texas that basically has no imports, figuring out what kind of the import supply function looks like is tough. And then from kind of a cost perspective, we say, do you bid above marginal cost? You have to think about how startups are compensated and how firms think about startup cost when they're solving their unit commitment problems. So, and we could go on and on listing various complications. But I think that being said, just because it's complicated certainly doesn't mean that we're going to throw up our hands and not think about trying to identify market power. But I think the upshot, at least from a market design point of view, is that you want to basically take the view, or my view personally, is if firms are put in a position where they have the incentive to exercise market power, they're probably going to do that, at least some of the time. So then the upshot there is to think about how to design markets in a way such that firms will not be put into that position. So when they're submitting, say, bids into these auctions, where they're not going to be thinking, if I change my bid, how is that going to influence the market price and stuff that could be tied to that market price? So in particular, other revenues from FTRs or from other generation that's being sold and so forth. So that's basically the way I think about it, is from a market design perspective, how to design it in such a way that firms aren't going to have those incentives. A couple of other kind of comments I kind of want to tee up, and then we can discuss. On the demand side, typically, in antitrust we think, well, there's something called demand that mitigates market power. When price goes up, people consume less of it. But of course, as we all know, in electricity markets, demand, is kind of notoriously unique in that there's very little demand elasticity. Are we going to actually get any traction on the demand side? I'm kind of on the fence as to whether to be optimistic about this or not. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but we see more and more smart meters installed, not only for commercial and industrial, but also residential customers. And so if markets are designed in ways that allow for the demand side to participate, either through kind of load aggregators or through passive demand response, if retailers provide incentives for customers of the C, I, and R flavor to participate, then maybe there'd be some response on the demand side. But I think this gets at a question, and I can't remember if I've heard Bill Hogan or others suggest this. We have all these smart meters installed. We spend a lot of money doing that. And the question is, why do we have smart meters but dumb pricing? And so we'd hope that at least on the demand side, we think about some retail policies that'll send more price signals to customers. Another topic I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit is virtual bidding. So I believe all organized markets in the U.S. have virtual bidding now. So, of course, this is where you don't have to be load, you don't have to be generation, and you can participate in these markets. So, in essence, you can participate in this market. So, why would we think that it would make sense to have market players bidding that aren't in the market, right? So I think we can come up with a couple of examples where in some cases virtual bidding might help the market, in some ways it might not so much help the market. So let me just kind of give an example of each. So why might we want virtual bidding? So we have more and more renewables in our ISOs now, right? So last count, Texas, I think 10% of all generation in 2013 was from wind. Renewables has its benefits. A downside of renewables is that you can't tell the wind when to blow, and you can't tell clouds when to not fly over the PV. So you talk to electrical engineers and the ISO operators, and this intermittency problem is becoming bigger and bigger. So what that means is that if someone out there can better forecast when the wind's going to blow and the sun's going to shine, whether that's a day ahead or 5 minutes ahead or an hour ahead or whatnot, virtual bidding can allow that market to be, or that information to be incorporated into the market. So a virtual bidder that can forecast that way would effectively predict that real-time prices, for example, would be higher than day-ahead prices, bid that in as kind of financial arbitrage, and effectively that information eventually will be incorporated into the market prices, which would affect dispatch. So that's an example of where virtual bidding could help the market. Examples of where virtual bidding may not so much help the market would be if virtual bidders have large holdings of FTRs. So effectively they have a large financial stake at the difference in two nodal prices, and they might have an incentive to virtual bid in a way that would affect those FTR revenues or CRR revenues. And of course, market monitors are aware of this and are concerned about that. And then finally, one more point, and this might move a little beyond the topic of market power of this panel, but in some work I did with Ali Hortasu, we analyzed bidding into ERCOT's balancing market and found a result that was very surprising to us. So we, as carefully as possible, basically analyzed different generators bidding into the balancing market, comparing bids to marginal cost. And what we found is that there was substantial dispatch inefficiency. And the reason for that is because many of the bidders were bidding above marginal cost. What was surprising about that was who was doing the bidding above marginal cost. It wasn't so much the large players, it was the smaller players that for whatever reason were basically saying, we're not going to participate in the balancing market. And unfortunately, from a dispatch efficiency perspective, some of those smaller players had lower cost units that if they had bid in and produced would have lowered the dispatch cost. When I was visiting the Texas PUC as kind of a non-paid consultant at the time, they were definitely very aware of the fact that these smaller players were not bidding in, but the focus was kind of the standard antitrust, big market power is the concern type logic. The focus was on the big firms and not on the smaller firms. And I think the view of ERCOT was these smaller firms, there's not a must-offer requirement in ERCOT, which basically means if you don't want to bid your units in for whatever reason, that's up to you. And I guess I'm okay with that. But nevertheless, it does result in dispatch inefficiency. And so the reason I bring this up is simply to say that even though this example in ERCOT may not fit the classic example of market power, if our lens is basically looking for dispatch inefficiency, whatever the source, whether it's market power by big players or other behavior by small players, then I think that's ultimately what we should be looking for. So keeping an eye more generally on factors that lead to dispatch inefficiency and prices that aren't competitive, and designing market policies and market design features around that.
Okay, yes. Good. Good morning. It's great to be able to speak on this panel. I want to start by saying, so thank you for inviting me. My remarks today are very much my own. That's why I get to have fun and come to these conferences. I do not necessarily speak for the Department of Justice. And today, though, what I am going to do is speak from a legal perspective. I'm on this panel with these great economists who are thinking about underlying market design and economic efficiency, and I'm going to look very much at something much more practical, which is, given market design as it exists, how do the antitrust laws play in? And I'm going to talk about one very specific case that's very dear to my heart, and that is, there are actually a pair of cases, U.S. versus Keyspan and U.S. versus Morgan Stanley. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with those cases. Let me give you the factual background, and then talk a little bit about the market power issues that were raised that I think are very interesting. Because these cases involve an agreement. They are Section 1 cases. They are about an agreement in restraint of trade. They're not about exercise of unilateral market power in the way that many of the withholding type analyses are looking for unilateral acts. The next thing I'm going to point out is that this case takes place in the context of a capacity market. It's nice, it's a little simpler to deal with. It doesn't have to do with all these operating characteristics and startup costs and environmental opportunity costs, all of which are really important in analyzing bids in energy markets. But I'm going to talk about a simpler thing, and this is the market for capacity, which is operated in this case in New York. Capacity is a product that is created to reflect the fact that a market to operate in electricity, because there's no storage, requires more capacity to be available than is actually needed or projected to be needed, because there's always a possibility that you're going to need reserves. So how are you going to get someone to build and maintain a certain percentage of the market that everyone expects will not be called? So there is a market for capacity. And the market for capacity clears in the same way that Steve discussed the market for energy in New Jersey, in New York. In New York, it is a buy-all, sell-all, and it's a must-sell obligation. And so each generator offers into the market. The offers are stacked. Demand is drawn down, and then you decide that there's a single market clearing price. So here's what happened factually. The market for capacity in New York, and particularly now there's a constrained area on Manhattan, as you can imagine, and I'm going to be talking about that part of the New York capacity market. The supply and demand were always very, very tight. And as FERC discusses, there was a 3 pivotal supplier test. There were 3 pivotal suppliers. They were given bid caps or offer caps. The highest offer cap in the market was that of Keyspan. And for many, many years, Keyspan just, every time they just bid their cap. And they knew they had market power, they bid at their cap, and that price set the market price. Now, this wonderful set of facts was coming to an end. there was a proposal that there was going to be entry into the market. And at the point when there was entry, there would be significant additional capacity available. Keyspan looked ahead and saw, and now I'm going to be speaking, let me just step back. This is a settled case, so I am speaking in stating allegations that are made in our complaint and in our settlement, so just to understand that these are allegations. But Keyspan anticipated that the tight supply and demand conditions would end soon because of the entry and would not return until the retirement of some old generation. So they had about a 3-year period when there was going to be much more capacity in the market than there had been in the past. And by doing an analysis, they could no longer be confident that their bid the cap strategy would always remain their best bid strategy. Here's why. When the market was very tight, all that Keyspan had to do, when Keyspan bidded its cap, almost all of its capacity was needed. So the cost, if you will, of withholding was quite small. Once there was a much larger amount of capacity available in the market, Keyspan was still going to have market power. And it still could bid its cap and set the market price. But the cost of that would be that a lot more of its capacity would not be taken in the market. So the cost of withholding that strategy would be larger. And it had to consider whether there were lower prices, other bid strategies that might be more profitable. So, at the same time in this market, there was one of the other rivals was for sale. Reliant owned some assets called the Astoria Generating Station. And Reliant put those assets on the market. And Keyspan considered buying those assets. They did an analysis, and they realized that if they purchased those assets, they would be sort of the 1 and 2 in the market, buying each other, and that was not going to pass antitrust scrutiny. But they saw that Astoria was being purchased with help from Morgan Stanley. And so Keyspan approached Morgan Stanley and said, here's a great idea. How about I just acquire from you a financial instrument? And this financial instrument is a swap. It's a revenue swap. And essentially, if Astoria's, if the price is, let me get this right, so I'm going to read it so that I can make sure. But what they did was for business school people, they bought the upside of Astoria's revenues. If market price for capacity was above $7.07, Astoria would pay Morgan Stanley the difference. And if the market price was below $7.07, Astoria would pay the difference. Now, with Keyspan, if the market price was above $7.57, Morgan Stanley would pay Keyspan the difference. And if it was below that, Keyspan would pay Morgan Stanley the difference. So it essentially was a doubling down on the market price by Keyspan. Fundamentally, what it did was give Keyspan almost the same revenues that it would have gotten if it had physically purchased the Astoria assets, because it got the upside of this trade. So what we determined was that Morgan Stanley said, yes, we'll make this financial instrument available to you, Keyspan, but only if we do the other side of the deal with your largest rival. And both sides understood this. Once Keyspan had the extra revenue stream that was being generated by the swap, it went right back to the situation where it always was more profitable for it to bid its cap. And our case was that the clear tendency of this agreement, the Morgan Stanley swap, was to alter Keyspan's bidding in the capacity markets The swap effectively eliminated any incentive that Keyspan had to compete for sales in exactly the same way that a purchase of the Astoria assets or a direct agreement between Keyspan and Astoria would have done. By adding the revenues from Astoria's capacity to Keyspan's own, the Keyspan-Morgan Stanley swap made bidding the cap Keyspan's most profitable strategy, regardless of what anybody else in the market bid. But without the swap, Keyspan would likely have had to have chosen from a range of potentially profitable competitive strategies in response to this new entry. And had it done so, the price of capacity likely would have declined. In fact, after entry, even though there was 1,000 megawatts of new entry, they bid their cap, the price did not decline. And so we challenged this agreement. And a couple of things I want to point out is that Keyspan had market power before the swap. It had market power after the swap. So what did the swap do? How did it make things worse? And as I explained, the way it made things worse was, even though it didn't change the fact that Keyspan had market power, it changed the kind of bid strategy that would be most profitable to Keyspan. And the second thing that I want to point out is the fact that we also sued Morgan Stanley. And that means that that agreement, which was based on Morgan Stanley being the middleman between these two parties, was liable for entering this agreement because it understood that that was exactly what was going to happen once it entered into both of these swaps together. And these cases together demonstrate that, and by the way, therefore they were profiting by Keyspan's exercise of market power. The cases together show that the department's willing to pursue agreements that interfere with the competitive process and pursue a case in which a financial instrument effectively eliminates the incentive to compete for sales in the same way that a physical acquisition asset would do, or that a direct agreement between the rivals would have done. So I just want to point out this is not theoretical economics. This was not. I have no opinion on whether this was a problem of market design. What we did see was, and we examined, was whether an agreement changed the way a monopolist would bid in a way that harmed the market. And I would point out, because earlier, when the earlier speaker was talking, we were talking about whether penalties change people's incentives. This was the first case under the Sherman Act where we actually received, it was a settlement, but it was the first case that the Justice Department received disgorgement in a civil case. And we got disgorgement disgorgement of profits both from Keyspan and from Morgan Stanley. So there was real money involved. And I would also point out that the only criticism that we really got in Tunney Act comments, people are allowed to comment on our settlement, was that the amount of money that we received was not high enough. And the court was very concerned that we did not extract enough money from Morgan Stanley. In the end, our settlement was approved, but I just want to point out that that was really the only controversy.
Thank you, Jade. Okay, well, let me turn this back on. Am I on? Am I on now? Yes, okay. So I just want to be mindful of the time. Right now we have 1:36, and how long does our panel go? Can someone tell me? 2:30. Oh, okay, that's good time. All right, excellent. So thank you all. Let's circle the wagons a little bit here and just review quickly what we've come around to. Bill started with a discussion of really the fundamental the fundamentals, the centerpiece of electricity markets, which is really the organized market. By the way, and I'm sure the FERC folks in the room can correct me on this, but something on the order of, 55 to 60% of our electricity in the U.S. flows through organized markets. The rest is through bilateral. Julie, is that a correct?
70.
Is it closer to 70 now? Oh, okay. So 3/4 of the electricity in the U.S. flows through organized markets. The rest is obviously, bilateral trading where folks are still picking up the phone saying, Joe, do you have 200 megawatts to sell me? That may be a simplification, but bilateral trading. So with that, the role of centralized markets, the market design, the structure of those markets is really crucially important in governing the competitive outcomes in those markets. So we've heard from Bill about market design issues, which go way back now, 15, 16, even longer, maybe 20 years. Steve sort of brought us around back down to the consumer level and from the perspective of how these markets are performing efficiently or not and how complex they are. We've heard a lot about the uniqueness of the electricity commodity, unit commitment problems. We've got markets defined by time of day, time of year. I mean, we have potentially thousands of markets that could be defined in the course of a year. It's a very complex and deep sort of problem that we see. And then Jade has brought us around at the end to talk about the actual competitive effects of behavior in these markets, which are more than likely to be a function of market design and structural problems inside organized markets. So we've sort of covered the gamut here on market design issues, how consumers are potentially affected through pricing and efficiency, and how antitrust enforcement sort of fits into this bigger picture more broadly. And we'll talk more in the conversation here about how FERC sort of complements that competition enforcement picture as we move along. So I have a series of questions that I'd like to ask folks. And let's start with Bill, since he sort of laid the groundwork for where we are in the organized market world. So the question is thus. In terms of identifying market power and mitigating market power, am I buzzing now? Too close to the microphone. Put this down here. Okay, apologies. The identification of market power, the mitigation of market power has come a long way, I think, since California. And I think we heard that from Bill in terms of using California as sort of a centerpiece example. What I'd like to know is what you consider to be the major empirical advances in market power identification and detection and mitigation since the California schemes of 1999 and 2000. So what are the procedural advances? What are the empirical advances? How have we advanced the state of the art in terms of knowing what market power is and dealing with it appropriately? How are enforcers approaching the problem? And when I say enforcers, I mean both regulatory sector regulators at the state and even at the federal level and even potentially at the state level, but also the antitrust enforcers as well.
Well, I would make 3 points in response to that off the top of my head here. The first one is the offer caps or bid caps that we talked about, which were sort of understood before that, but they were kind of an emergency measure in response to the California case, and now are generally understood every place, and they're used selectively in these various markets when people, fail transportation constrained pivotal supplier tests and so on. But I think they're basically pretty straightforward and they work pretty well. That's very important. Second is that we've, at least in Texas, and actually in many other places as well, though it still hasn't fully matured, but we've changed our view about high prices. So all of the concerns about the missing money and capacity markets and the problems that Jade was talking about, we think that maybe sometimes high prices are actually part of the solution, not part of the problem. And the institutionalization of the operating reserve demand curve in Texas is a very straightforward example of that idea, which could go as high in principle as to $9,000 as a scarcity price. And it has a very clear way of identifying the difference between scarcity price and exercising market power. So you can have the operating reserve demand curve, you could have offer caps, and both of them would work just fine together. And then you could have high prices when the system was tight, but you didn't have the exercise of market power. And then the third point is what I've said with respect to FERC enforcement, where I think the direction of progress has been negative. So I think it's actually regressed dramatically because of what's happened under their fraud-based approach, their view that market design is not their problem, that they don't have to even think or discuss those problems. All they have to do is find that you did something I don't like, and I can show you meant to do it. And then if I did that, then we're done, and now we've got you, and now we're going to take you through a complicated settlement process in order to get you to pay a lot of money. And we're never going to reveal the details of what actually went on or in the analysis, so nobody else knows what it is. This is not progress.
Other comments? Steve, do you want to comment on this? Jade, do you have a response?
I'd say I'm lucky I don't have to enforce a manipulation statute and have to deal with the fraud part of it. So I do think that I'm interested in understanding how we think about scarcity rents and what market design should be taking into account with scarcity rents when it is so difficult for the market to respond to scarcity. I mean, usually, in my naive view of scarcity rents, is that there's a high price that attracts some change in market behavior, usually entry, or additional output, and then prices drop. So in terms of addressing issues of sort of just and reasonable pricing, I know that's a regulatory concept. But even in terms of antitrust, there's an underlying idea that there will be able to be a response to scarcity, and that's why it's efficient to allow prices to rise. So if you could address that.
Can I just interrupt? Can you
Sure.
turn your mic on? I think your mic's off.
I'm sorry.
Steve, are you on?
I'm sorry.
Okay, right.
I hope you can.
We could hear you, but now we can hear you even better.
Okay, I apologize.
That's okay.
Well, let's look at Texas again. The experience is accumulating because it hasn't been this design feature which I worked on with the ERCOT folks is not, the operating reserve demand hasn't been that long, but people respond. So when the prices start going up, the plants become available. And they don't take them out for maintenance at that time and so forth. And second, there's been quite a bit of investment. Now, I'm not sure it's because of that, but there's certainly there's quite a bit of new plant coming online in Texas recently, and there's a little puzzle about exactly why it's happening. I think the experience in Australia is quite relevant here. So Australia for a long time has had this, now I think $12,000 offer, price cap story, and basically sometimes the price goes to $12,000, and it lasts about a half an hour. Because if you're a generator and you're not running and you're not collecting them, this is really a big problem. So they bring them back online, they bring on extra queues, they use the more expensive whatever they're going to do. So it never lasts very long. They went through a lot of agony in Australia about designing some complicated ramping down if it was going to go on and it was going to absorb the GDP of Australia. But it actually turned out that in reality, people responded so fast that it was just not a problem. So you don't get 10,000 megawatts of new construction over the weekend, but you do get new stuff coming in faster. You get people operating in very different ways. And if the market tariffs are designed right, you're also sending a signal to the demand side, which is the part that we've been ignoring all this time.
Right.
And I can respond very quickly in my house, so there's lots of response built into that system. And as Steve said, we need smart prices to go with those smart meters.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let me ask Steve the next question. The nexus between the wholesale markets and the retail markets is becoming, in my view, and I'm certainly open to debate on this, is not becoming clearer. It's becoming much muddier. We've got Lots of changes at the wholesale level, market design issues. We've got lots of entry at the wholesale level, non-traditional technologies, transmission, independent transmission. We obviously have had independent generation around for some time. We have now larger scale demand response at the wholesale level. We also have this whole portfolio of consumer level technologies, distributed generation, demand response at the consumer level, very disaggregated. So there's a lot going on. These markets are becoming more complicated as opposed to less. So this nexus between wholesale and retail and the transmission of price signals from wholesale to retail is fraught with some transparency issues, very different market structures at wholesale versus at retail, different dynamics and incentives coming out of that. And certainly the regulatory issues are very complex, federal regulation versus state regulation. So Steve, where do you see the major improvements over time and how prices are being signaled out of the wholesale market to the retail level? Do you see improvements? I mean, are things getting better as opposed to worse? Can consumers respond to more accurate price signals now?
Sure. So I think a lot of the earlier work focused largely on the supply side. So the first couple chapters of the book, right, are basically talking about supply side policies and market power, and the reason is there just was not a whole lot of activity, on the demand side. I was looking up these numbers this morning. Obviously part of getting response on the demand side is having the metering technology in place. And for commercial and industrial, in many places there's been that technology in place for a while. As of last count, 46 million house residentials across the country have smart meters or AMI. So there's certainly a lot of potential on the demand side there. And I think this also can kind of intersect with the discussion of competition on the retail side. So there are about a dozen states that have retail competition now. And retail competition potentially gives you a lot of benefits, right? It allows you and this is for commercial, industrial, and residential, right? It allows you to kind of harness the powers of competition, get prices hopefully to more competitive levels, but then hopefully allows you to add competitive retailers, add value-added services. So it could be real-time pricing, it could be behind-the-meter technology, could be hedging services, and so forth. And so I think there is certainly a role for. All right, so let's say this. So, for example, in Texas, if I'm a retailer and I serve Jade, we might have an agreement, a contract that basically says she's going to pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour no matter when she consumes. Okay, but her house is metered all the time, and so if she consumes a whole lot of power at 6 p.m., she may not be paying for that directly, but I, the retailer, I'm going to be aware of that because I'm going to be paying for her load at very expensive times. So that gives me a couple of incentives, right? On one hand, it might mean that when her contract comes up next year, I say, hey, no, thank you, I don't want you as a customer anymore. So cherry picking the customers that basically have the favorable load profiles. But what it also might mean is I would say, hey, why don't we make a deal here? I'm going to help subsidize some behind-the-meter technology, whether it be a Nest thermostat or devices you can control with your phone that can set your thermostat at different settings, or pool pumps and that sort of stuff. And that might create a role for when price caps are hit or prices go really high. When, as Bill noted, prices should be really high when there's true scarcity. We want prices to be really high. That would send the signals not only to start up, as Bill just said, on the supply side, but on the demand side for some creative demand-side services in order to try and reduce consumption. Now, I think the question is, are we more likely to see that in a competitive retail market or one that doesn't have competition? And I think it could cut either way. On one hand, you might think in a competitive market there's more role for retailers to kind of be innovative. On the other hand, if it's a competitive market and Jade is my customer and I think she's going to leave after 6 months because there's a high churn rate, I may not want to subsidize her putting in a Nest thermostat. So I can see that cutting both ways. But I think it's very interesting to think going forward, certainly in the competitive markets, what sort of new interactions between retailers and customers to provide demand response, whether it be passive demand response or a load aggregated demand response that can actually be bid in the ancillary service markets.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any views on On where efficiency, if you think about efficiency sort of as a subset of services, do we have any views on where that's most efficiently delivered in the supply chain? Or, I live in Boulder, where if you don't have rooftop solar, then you're out of the club. Unfortunately, my house is situated in a way that does not accommodate rooftop solar, but there is Boulder is in the process of municipalizing right now and engaged in a pretty knockdown drag out with Xcel, which is the incumbent utility in Colorado. The whole development of consumer-level disaggregated efficiency technology is sort of raising the question of where is this efficiency most efficiently delivered in the supply chain? Is it delivered most efficiently at the wholesale level, where you have more organized markets, you've got potentially more entry points, or is it really efficiently delivered at the consumer level, where you have a lot of disaggregation, potentially a lot of inefficiencies in how consumers are interconnecting with the grid? And does anyone have a view on that? I mean, that's popping up more and more these days, this question, as we get into competitive issues involving potential foreclosure of rivals, utility rivals who want to enter these efficiency markets. Any ideas or thoughts?
What do you mean by efficiency? Are you talking about insulating your house better so that it uses less energy all the time, or efficiency in the economic sense of responding quickly to price signals?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's anything that reduces demand, better response to price signals. It could include even, and this distributed generation isn't efficiency per se, but more a consumer level choice that can be made. So anything in that category of technologies.
Well, this is a subject of very active conversation, as you know, in various places.
Turn on your mic.
It's on. If that doesn't seem to help.
There, now you
okay.
said it in the wrong place.
Sorry. Maybe I have to get the thing out in the public domain here so it can transmit. I think the discussion in particular that's going on in New York right now is hopefully going to educate us all about this problem. And there's the simple, what I consider to be the relatively simple question of taking the wholesale short-term prices and having those go through to customers so that they can take advantage of them. The much more interesting and more complicated question that we don't really understand the answer to very well is how those prices ought to be modified as you go down the feeders, to go down to the system where you're dealing with voltage problems and transformer problems and all the other kinds of things. And you want to make sure you aren't getting tied up and sending the wrong signals to people about what they should actually be doing at that particular point. And that's a subject that they're discussing in New York at length. I just have to believe that when we get all finished with all this story, it's going to have a sort of sensible price design that goes all the way down as far as it goes, and then let people make their choices themselves and take advantage of it. We don't cross-subsidize through those prices. Getting from here to there is going to be incredibly difficult because we are stuck with the existing tariffs that we have, which are based on the assumption that you have no choices and you wouldn't choose if you could. So it's a big transformation that has to take place. I think it's actually a research question I don't think there is a well-known answer to the question that you're asking because of all of these complications of how you deal with these other characteristics. For example, suppose it turns out, I don't think this is impossible, suppose it turns out that the answer is we don't need reactive prices on the wholesale level, high voltage grid, because reactive power isn't quite as important up there. At that level, and we can deal with it the way we do now, which is imperfectly. But when you get down to the distribution, it's mostly about voltage control, and that's reactive power. And now we want to have reactive and real power prices. Well, that's going to be a revolution. So, I just pose that as a question. I don't know the answer.
So let's circle back a little bit to the question of sort of competition enforcement, and I've written on this pretty extensively in both economics and law journals, but. Electricity, much like telecom and some other areas, is really potentially too many cooks in the kitchen problem. Multiple jurisdictions. FERC obviously enforces its statutes. The DOJ and the FTC enforce their statutes. Some of our states have competition laws. California has the Cartwright Act, for example. So electricity competition analysis, whether it's a merger case or whether it's a case involving conduct, Section 1 case, for example, is going to potentially involve many jurisdictions, many forms of enforcement regulation. So the question is, and maybe Jade wants to start here, is are there too many cooks in the kitchen? Are we looking at any potential Alamos? I had this conversation with a former FERC chairman many years ago, where he said to me, well, show me an Alamo where FERC came up with a very different outcome or a different remedy, for example, for a merger case or for a Section 1 or a Section 2 case. There haven't been any Section 2 cases, by the way. No monopolization cases in electricity. But show me the Alamos. Show me where there's incompatibility or friction between the regulatory competition enforcement and the antitrust enforcement regime. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that first of all, the FERC and DOJ and under the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, et cetera, they have different standards. They have different tools. They have different powers to demand information. They have different time constraints. And so to say that you have two separate outcomes means that there's some kind of giant conflict, that they're not viewing the world the same is I think, not correct. There have been situations where the FERC has, under its own standards, found that a merger was allowed, and where later we settled in an enforcement action. But I think that the more important point that you raise is sort of conceptual, this too many cooks idea. Because maybe this is even going to what the kind of market design issue that Bill was talking about, and Steve. I thought that what we were trying to do was create competitive markets for power. And if we don't believe that the markets are competitive, and this is just a giant, very complicated administrative structure for setting rates, well then I'm an extra cook. If we actually think that there's competition in these markets, then things that affect competition in the market, like mergers, and specifically like agreements that even if you have a competitive market, can change people's incentives to operate in a competitive fashion. Certainly enforcement around those issues is still necessary, and not necessarily the job of the FERC, which is looking at structural things, at creating markets that are operating as competitively as they can, and in limiting very fundamentally unilateral market power, which, as we all know, the antitrust laws are not really aimed at, in the sense of looking at a pure restriction of output or increase in price, which really is not a violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act. So I don't see myself as an extra cook. I think I have to choose my kitchens wisely.
Other thoughts, Bill or Steve?
Well, I agree with Jade, and I don't see it as a too many cooks problem. I would say, I mean, as I said, I think we need better cooking schools, and carrying the metaphor forward. And I think there's something important missing, and it's what James, in the unilateral market power story or unilateral manipulation kind of story, where it's not fraudulent in the way the dictionary describes it. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm a wind generator, and I'm going to bid minus the production tax credit because I'm going to make up the money on the production tax credit, and I'm going to manipulate the prices in the market so they can do all those kinds of things. And it's not like it's a secret. It's not like it's deceptive. It's not like it's fraudulent and so forth. They're just following public policy. How do we analyze those kinds of problems? Now, in the case of wind guys, since they're green and they're good guys, so that's good acts, not bad acts. But if they were doing something else, and I could give you examples of those which are cases that are under consideration, I would say It's just because of who they are and the kind of thing. We don't like them, and it's bad acts. So we don't have a principled way of dealing with that problem, and I think it's a very serious deficiency. So I think we don't have the proper authority, and we don't have the proper principles laid out, and we have people who are torquing the authority that they do have in an unprincipled way, which is doing real harm to the markets.
So for those of you who may not be as close to this issue as some of the experts in the room, the inability of the antitrust laws to reach to unilateral withholding is really quite troublesome. I mean, we've now seen some pretty significant cases of withholding that have created enormous price hikes up in the Northeast, and which really stand to deliver huge amounts of damage to consumers. This is an essential commodity. It's an important commodity. And the antitrust laws do not reach to simple withholding of capacity or output to jack up the price. That's not a violation of the antitrust laws. You know, there's market power everywhere, from essentially being able to charge whatever prices you want because you can. So the question is, what do we do about that? Whose purview is that under? Well, FERC can reach to that through through the Federal Power Act for just and reasonable, whether rates are just and reasonable. There's some argument that we have been advocating for at AAI that maybe Section 5 of the FTC Act could reach to that type of unilateral withholding behavior. But it remains problematic. And so one question for Bill, and Steve will probably want to chime in on this too, in terms of how the consumer can better respond now than the consumer could 10 years ago because they have more tools at their disposal. Bill, how have markets changed since California in a way that creates new incentives or abilities to withhold, or how have rules changed, or sort of the enforcement of market rules changed in a way that is creating new or different types of withholding opportunities?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I certainly don't have a comprehensive answer. I would say the general trend that I would say that's the dominant thing is more and more opportunities to respond are developing, partly because of technology, and it's been constrained by poor tariff design. So that's one component that makes it harder for people to exercise those. And it's been distorted by bad tariff design, so we get people getting subsidies to do, with all due respect to my friends in Boulder, to do things which make no economic sense. And so you have those two tensions going on, and I think getting the tariff systems and the pricing systems that reflect the real opportunity costs is going to be necessary to take advantage of all these enormous technological opportunities that are developing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important takeaway. That with three economists up here, obviously everyone will say it's get the prices right, and much good stuff will follow. But getting the prices right has always been difficult in electricity, and again with this nexus between wholesale and retail becoming fuzzier as opposed to more clear, at least in my view. The question is, what tools does the consumer have at their disposal to sort of combat the exercise of market power? And with the technological advances that Bill is alluding to, and I mean it's an exciting time. We see more technology now than I think we ever have before. Will consumers avail themselves of these choices? Fred Kahn said to me about 15 years ago, that first retail choice experiment in the electricity industry was almost a failure. Nobody wanted to choose. Nobody wanted to exercise their ability to choose their wholesale supplier. Everybody wanted to stay with the branded, reliable, well-known incumbent utility. So retail choice was not a smashing success. And in fact, if you talk to firms that do offer innovative billing services, they'll tell you that consumers really don't care much about electricity. They care what they pay for it, but they don't really care about a whole lot else. So we're dealing with a very sort of intractable framework here. So how do we get consumers to be more responsive?
Right. So I mean, customers obviously are not going to be thinking of it as in terms of how do you mitigate market power, right? An individual customer, if you're paying kind of P times Q, price times quantity, it's not as if changing the Q is going to change the price a whole lot, but it is trying to get the Q down at any given point in time. I think that, so the hope, and this is, I guess, reiterating what I said before, is the hope is the intersection of retail choice and new technologies will create new services. There is a lot of inertia in these markets. And I think in terms of evaluating retail choice, sometimes you'll see these numbers cited where people either count, and Texas, I admit, does this too, will count the number of different plans one has, right? Or you'll count the number of providers, or you'll cite the number of people who've switched. And I don't think that's really the right metric. I mean, the two things you're looking for more competitive prices, and you're looking for more value-added services. And so when you're evaluating success, those are the two things you basically want to be looking at. The thought experiment that I pose to people is, when states have retail choice, basically there's kind of a default rate for the incumbent. And so imagine a state that made that default rate really high, and then, say, half the people switched away from the incumbent. And then imagine another state where the default rate was really low and not that many people switched. I'd argue that state 2 is probably better because half the people in state 1 are paying higher prices, right? But that's not what's cited. So I think better research needs to be done to understand. Let's not get caught up in counting switching numbers and number of plans and stuff like that, because there's a whole lot of choice out there. I pulled some numbers yesterday, and some of the states that have retail choice, there are between 100 and 200 plans you can choose from. Is that necessarily a good thing? No, I don't know. I want to know what the rates are, and I want to know what the value-added services are.
I just, as an observer of these markets and as a consumer, I think that there has been a lot of concern about whether consumers want to choose and whether we should let them choose, whether regulators feel they need to be protected from choice. And my sense is that until very recently, when we started having the technology that really allowed demand response, the price signals that consumers were supposed to be responding to were really minimal. They were still attenuated. They were more contract forms, which is not a bad thing. But they were not they were not getting the information that they needed to actually make some choices. And I really think that that's the big opportunity that some of these new technologies are going to give. And the bang for the buck in going back to your first question is, if a wholesale generator wants to make a decision as to whether to withhold from the market, not to operate, to forego revenues because of the effect on price across the rest of his portfolio, he knows what the cost is going to be. He has to have a good sense of what the bang for the buck is. And one of the reasons that this has been so successful in wholesale generation markets is because it has been relatively easy to predict demand. Demand is relatively inflexible because people are not responding to price. You can look at output based on weather, based on who else is likely to be operating, whether there are outages, and you can get a pretty good sense of what demand is going to be. If we actually had price response on the demand side, it would become much riskier to actually engage in some of these withholding behaviors, especially in the short term. Do you think that's true, both of you? Am I a cockeyed optimist?
Well, I think the second part is clearly true. That if you had demand participation and better signals, that would make a much more elastic market and make it much. I don't dispute that. I'm a little nervous about the first statement that it's been so easy to exercise market power, because I don't think it actually has.
Well, it's been easier than in other markets, is what I think it may be true.
I don't know. I end up spending a lot of. I pay a lot of money at that restaurant down there in Belmont because it's there in Belmont, and the food doesn't cost them that much, They have a locational advantage, and they extract it from me, and I go there and I take it from
I'd like to throw it open to the audience for questions. I'll push this to the side. Any questions for Bill, Steve, or Jade on what we've been discussing, or other questions, new questions, potentially? Yes.
Professor Hogan, was the problem in California, and would the problem today, if somebody wanted to separate the market operator function from the system operator function, so much that the functions were separated, or that the two entities, the PX and the ISO, had inconsistent tariffs that enabled market participants, generators, to bypass the day-ahead market and trade excessively in the real-time market, with the other problem being that the retail customers were insulated from the ups and downs of the wholesale price market.
The fundamental problem in California and every place that tries to deal with this is that the transmission balancing and all that kind of thing and the market are just two sides of the same coin. And so if you want to create two different institutions to do one thing, you're going to have fundamental inconsistencies, or one of them is not going to be doing anything other than opening the mail, right? And then the other one's going to make all the decisions. So, and the original conversation in California they tried to steer it to the PX wouldn't actually do anything and everything would be done by the Cal ISO, everything important. But then they figured out, Enron figured out, and lots of other people figured out that if they did that, then you could use the balancing market as the efficient market, and that would destroy the opportunities for all of these traders to make all of this money. So they designed the balancing market to be inefficient, intentionally, so it wouldn't clear. That was the original structure of the California ISO design, precisely so that the PX had something to do with the Cal. And so it is the same thing. The balancing market, the transmission congestion management, all those kinds, they are the same thing, and you have to design it in such a way that recognizes that, and trying to separate it into two institutions is a fundamental conceptual flaw. They are just not something that can be separated.
Other questions? Anything else? Peter.
I have a question for the panelists. It's a little bit wonky, but here we are. What do the panelists view as the best diagnostic tools for assessing market power? We have HHIs, we have actual simulations of markets, we have pivotal supplier tests, we have all sorts of things. And I'd just like to hear from each of them what they think are the right tools to use, right kinds of analysis.
So I guess I can step in first. I think one thing that we very quickly learned about electricity that's different is the answer is not HHI, and it's not Herfindahl's. Even pivotal supplier indexes, at least if the definition is can one player withhold all capacity and get the price to the cap, is not really the right measure either. I think what you want to know is if you're asking the question about the incentive to exercise market power, is you want to know what their residual demand function looks like and how steep it is. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that's not an easy task. It's not just like you draw it on the chalkboard, but conceptually, that's how I think about it.
Well, I agree with the conceptual story. I think it's a very hard problem, and it's much harder when you look at the transmission interaction. And I wrote about that a long time ago, and I said, this is really going to be difficult because you can increase production as a way to manipulate, and because of the interactions in the transmission grid. So you can't even get the sign right looking at that. But I go back to what I said before. I think the diagnosis is hard. I think the prescription is easy. The prescription is offer caps, and they're so innocuous, relatively speaking. They're not completely innocuous. I wouldn't do it to everything all the time, but I would have a pretty weak diagnostic test like pivotal supplier, and then as soon as I thought it was going to be a problem, I'd impose the mitigation, which is what gets done in place, and we've got these market monitors. They know how to do this. They're very sophisticated, and they invoke them when they think they need them, and it basically becomes a non-problem. If you're trying to do it without offer caps because you have an ideological objection to it, because you're interfering with the marketplace, and you want to do it through structural mechanisms or something like that, well, you're going to fund a lot of PhD dissertations. But if you're willing to use that simple solution, the problem really becomes de minimis in real-time markets. Now, I think the day-ahead story is because they're really not physical markets; they're financial markets. I think, and it depends on what you're doing in real time. And if you don't have market power in real time, it's very hard to exercise market power in the day ahead on a sustained basis. You can do a one-off, but you can't do very much. So I think the real problem is real time, but there's an easy solution.
Just to point out that the antitrust guidelines for analyzing market power actually has caught up to the electric industry. We had always recognized that HHI's pure concentration numbers were not very helpful in analyzing the ability to exercise market power, and more specifically, what acquisitions would do to your incentives and ability to manipulate markets or to increase price. I won't use the M word there. And so long ago, we were applying much more practical indicators. And more recently, the fundamental statement of the antitrust agencies on how they analyze markets has gone much more toward saying that they use competitive effects to determine whether to challenge transactions or behaviors. And that's fundamentally what the ways in which people have been talking about here, which is look at how the transaction would change incentives or ability. Stating that structure is easy. Applying it, particularly in energy markets, is not that easy because, particularly because of things like operating characteristics that may limit an operator's ability to say, oh, I would like to withhold this plant, or I would like to up the output of this plant in a strategic way. And in the effect, very much the effect of output on congestion and how congestion can affect prices. And so I will just say that we work very hard in doing our competitive analyses in these markets to take those characteristics into effect, but we're not trying to design the whole market. We're looking at individual instances, and so it's a little bit easier to get down in the weeds on those specific transactions.
This gentleman.
I just had a, question regarding what you were calling offer caps. Do you have any opinion on the differences in how that's carried out? Cost-based offer type regime and PJM versus like a reference price regime, and I think most of the other RTOs.
I don't. I think it's not an irrelevant question, and I think it's important to understand what's going on. But I think they're closer than. First of all, they should be generator specific, so it's not a uniform number for the whole system. And then even when they do cost-based caps, they're trying to give it some windage so that they have, if we make a mistake, we're biasing it in the right direction, which is a little bit higher. Because what we're worried about is not whether or not somebody's raising their offer by $10 or $20. We're worried about them extracting $200 or $500 when we didn't want them to. So there's a lot of room for that to maneuver. I think the really hard problem with all of these kinds of things is when you get into really tight situations and fuel costs go way up. So the polar vortex kind of situation, and that's a much more complicated situation where we'd probably want to think about that very carefully, because what people define as the cost is yesterday's cost. So I would like to buy some of yesterday's gas today. And that price can differ by a lot. And so that's a tougher problem, but I don't think it's insurmountable. And I think the market monitors are quite sophisticated about recognizing that. They have to get the rules right. So New England had a problem with the rules, and you had to buy yesterday's gas. So please, and so they would say, okay, well, I don't have any gas because I can't get yesterday's gas. And so that's an issue, but those problems can be addressed and fixed, I think.
Dick?
Not bidding your marginal cost?
Well, if you have a very good market design, the answer is probably
yeah. Successful market design.
Right. I would say there's a definitional problem, but what is it actually? The marginal cost.
You're the market participant. You know what your marginal cost.
But I don't think there's any. I can't think of any societal benefit. I can think of a private benefit for doing it, which is the market power.
I didn't ask for a private benefit.
Yeah, but I don't. I mean, justifying it on the basis that of some other collateral effect, it depends very much if you have a good market design or not. So if you have a terrible market design, it might be terrific because it helps overcome the problems of the market design. But
two wrongs make a right.
Well. They could. It depends. I mean, if you look in the actually, some of these things are discussed in this book here. If you look, and they make essentially the same point that if you have a really inefficient market design, which is going to cause the lights to go out, and then somebody finds a way to do things which are not illegal and not fraudulent, but are certainly not what people thought was going to happen, the big surprise, and it undoes the problem, I would say that's a good outcome. Now, if they lie, they commit fraud, something that's different. So I think it depends on the market, but if in a well-designed market case, I think that the hope is the answer is that your question is no. There isn't any need for it.
I would just say that I think that the difficulty is the one that Bill raised, and I'm not speaking as an economist because I'm not, but it always has seemed to me that it's quite difficult to determine all the things that go into marginal cost, and that the confidence of regulators in identifying the marginal cost and the fact that someone has bid above a marginal cost or offered above a marginal cost is interesting to me, because I thought that one of the great things about competitive markets is that all of those factors can be taken into account more efficiently and more precisely by the offeror than by somebody outside. And so once again, I think it's not the question that you asked, Dick, is sort of the simple question. The harder question is, how can we tell if they have?
Question here?
So I will say from the beginning, I'm an expert at this stuff for about 2 months. So if I've completely misunderstood, I will sit down. In somewhat following up on that, in the context of a mandatory capacity market, which we care about, right? So the question of why would you not bid your marginal cost? We might bid zero, so as to ensure that your capacity cleared the market. Now, if that question and that concept is outside of the bounds of this conversation today, I'll sit down. But I mean, is there any harm done by someone trying to ensure that their capacity that they've arranged for clears the market by bidding zero, or whatever, to make certain bidding below their marginal cost so as to ensure they clear the market? Is that an answerable question? Does that make sense, or have I misstated this?
Look, can I just chime in on that? I mean, two possible responses. One is, unless that's a predatory strategy, I mean, you're attempting to drive out rivals by bidding below cost, then. Yeah, I think that would assume a good deal of market misinformation or lack of information on the parts of the various market participants, and I think we've heard that most participants in these markets are pretty sophisticated, and the markets are fairly transparent, and they're also repeated games, right? So there's a good deal of I think information that goes into the bidding strategies behind load-serving entities, different types of suppliers, and that sort of thing. But that's just my reaction. Other reactions over here?
Well, there is the minimum offer pricing rule issue. Okay, so that's different. So now we have a situation where we're not about existing capacity. We're talking about prospective. People are going to build something. It's too expensive, but when I force it into the market, I'll depress the price enough so that I make it up on volume. And I have a way of collecting the cost of the new capacity from my loads by way of, because I'm a load-serving entity that works with the regulator and controls them, or the state legislature has mandated that they pay for it or something like that. So that's just the flip side of monopoly on the supply side. That's monopsony on the demand side, where you use excess capacity to reduce the net demand in order to depress the price. And that's a problem. And FERC has jumped in and all over the place. And if you're an existing load, you can bid in a low price. But if you're existing capacity, you can bid in a low price. But if you're part of this new capacity, then they have this rule. And then there's the complicated question of when does new become old, and all that sort of stuff. And there's a whole set of complications that arise from that. But the answer is, you can certainly have situations like that when the load-serving entity is controlling the capacity and they would like lower prices in the capacity market because they're buying a lot from everybody else, which is just the mirror image of the generator wants high prices because they're selling a lot of things.
If I can ask a question, and honestly, this is show my economic ignorance. How do you look at that decision you just discussed as not just a build or buy decision by the LSE? That the LSE says, I'm looking at these capacity prices out in the market, and I think I can build a plant that'll supply it at lower than what the present capacity prices are. So, which would seem to me to be an efficient response to an entry signal. So, can you explain?
Yeah, the different. If the factual situation you described would be okay. It's when they build something which is more expensive than the capacity that they can buy in the marketplace in order to depress the capacity prices in the marketplace because they have to buy a lot of other capacity in order to serve their load. And that's what happened in New Jersey. And in the first draft of the legislation in New Jersey, they were even stupid enough to put it into legislation. And what's the big benefit? Is that, well, we're going to depress the capacity prices so much, it's going to make up this expensive plant, and the overall cost of the load is going to go down, and we're going to have a non-bypassable charge in order to collect it. And then somebody pointed out that this was monopsony, and it was going to get the regulators all excited, so they took that language out of the bill, but they still had the bill. So it wasn't conceptually complicated. So if you're coming in and building things which are cheaper than the alternative, that's good. That's competition and entry and all the other kind of things. When you're coming in and you're building things which are much more expensive than the alternative you could buy in the marketplace, but you're going to depress the price in the marketplace for all the other stuff that you have to buy, then you say, that's just monopsony power. That's just a variant of the flip side of monopoly.
I'd love to talk more about that, but there are pending cases on this, and you raised them, so I feel.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I want to thank our panelists, Bill Hogan, Steve Puller, Jade Eaton.